Part 3, Chapter 13 of By What Authority by Robert Hugh BENSON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In prison. Anthony found several friends in the Clink prison in Southwark, whither he was brought up from Stanfield Place after his arrest. Life there was very strange, a combination of suffering and extraordinary relaxation. He had a tiny cell 9 feet by 5, with one little window high up, and for the first month of his imprisonment wore irons. At the same time his gaoler was so much open to bribery that he always found his door open on Sunday morning, and was able to shuffle upstairs and say mass in the cell of Ralph Emerson, once the companion of Campion and a lay brother in the Society of Jesus. There he met a large number of Catholics, some of whom he had come across in his travels, and he even ministered the sacraments to others who managed to come in from the outside. His chief sorrow was that his friend and host had been taken to the Counter in Wood Street. It was a month before he heard all that had happened on the night of his arrest and on the previous days. He had been separated at once from his friends, and although he had heard his guards talking, both in the hall where he had been kept the rest of the night, and during the long hot ride to London the next day, yet at first he was so bewildered by Mary's death that what they said made little impression on him. But after he had been examined both by magistrates and the commissioners, and very little evidence was forthcoming, his irons were struck off, and he was allowed much more liberty than before, and at last, to his great joy, Isabel was admitted to see him. She herself had come straight up to the Marretts' house, both of whom still lived on in Wharf Street, though old and infirm, and day by day she attempted to get access to her brother, until at last, by dint of bribery, she was successful. Then she told him the whole story. "When we left the garden house," she said, "we went straight back, and Mary found Mr. Graves in the parlour off the hall. Oh, Anthony, how she ordered him about! And how frightened he was of her! The end was that he sent a message to the stables for her horses to be got ready, as she said. I went up with her to help her to make ready, and we kissed one another up there, for you know we dared not make as if we said good-bye downstairs. Then we came down for her to mount, and then we saw what we had not known before, that all the stable yard was filled with the men's horses, saddled and bridled. However, we said nothing, except that Mary asked a man what the devil he was looking at, when he stared up at her as she stood on the block drawing on her gloves before she mounted. There were 1 or 2 torches burning in cressets, and I saw her so plainly turn the corner down towards the church. Then I went upstairs again, but I could not go to my room, but stood at the gallery window outside looking down at the court, for I knew that if there was any danger it would come from there. Then presently I heard a noise and a shouting, and a man ran in through the gates to the stable yard, and almost directly, it seemed, 3 or 4 rode out at full gallop across the court and down by the church. The window was open, and I could hear the noise down towards the village. Then more and more came pouring out, and all turned the corner and galloped, all but one whose horse slipped and came down with a crash. Oh, Anthony, how I prayed! Then I saw Mr. Lackington." Isabel stopped a moment at the name, and then went on again. "And he was on horseback too in the court, but he was shouting to 2 or 3 more who were just mounting, 'Across the field! Across the field! Cut them off!' I could hear it so plainly, and I saw the stable gate was open, and they went through, and I could hear them galloping on the grass. And then I knew what was happening, and I went back to my room and shut the door." Isabel stopped again, and Anthony took her hand softly in his own and stroked it. Then she went on. "Well, I saw them bring you back from the gallery window, and ran to the top of the stairs, and saw you go through into the hall, where the magistrates were waiting, and the door was shut. And then I went back to my place at the window, and then presently they brought in Mary. I reached the bottom of the stairs just as they set her down, and I told them to bring her upstairs, and they did, and laid her on the bed where we had sat together all the afternoon, and I would let no one in. I did it all myself. And then I set the tapers round her, and put the crucifix that was round my neck into her fingers, which I had laid on her breast. And there she lay on the great bed. Her face was like a child's, fast asleep, smiling. And then I kissed her again, and whispered, 'Thank you, Mary.' For though I did not know all, I knew enough, and that it was for you." Anthony had thrown his arms on the table, and his face was buried in them. Isabel put out her hand and stroked his curly head gently as she went on, and told him in the same quiet voice of how Mary had tried to save him by lashing his horse, as she caught sight of the man waiting at the entrance of the field path, and riding in between him and Anthony. The man had declared in his panic of fear before the magistrates that he had never dreamed of doing Mistress Corbet an injury, but that she had ridden across just as he drew the trigger to shoot the priest's horse and stop him that way. When Isabel had finished, Anthony still lay with his head on his arms. "Why, Anthony, my darling," she said, "what could be more perfect? How proud I am of you both." She told him, too, how they had been tracked to Stanfield. Lackington had let it out in his exultation. The sailor at Greenhithe was one of his agents, an apostate like his master. He had recognized that the party consisted of Catholics by Anthony's breaking of the bread. He had been placed there to watch the ferry, and had sent messages at once to Nichol and Lackington. Then the party had been followed, but had been lost sight of, thanks to Anthony's ruse. Nichol had then flung out a cordon across the principal roads that bounded Stanstead Woods on the south; and Lackington, when he arrived a few hours later, had kept them there all night. The cordon consisted of idlers and children picked up at Wrotham, and the tramp who feigned to be asleep had been one of them. When they had passed, he had given the signal to his nearest neighbour, and had followed them up. Nichol was soon at the place, and after them, and had followed to Stanfield with Lackington behind. Then watchers had been set round the house, the magistrates communicated with, and as soon as Hubert and Mr. Graves had arrived, the assault had been made. Hubert had not been told who the priest was, but he had leaped at an opportunity to harass Mr. Buxton. He had been given to understand that Anthony and Isabel were still in the north. "He did not know, indeed he did not," cried Isabel piteously. At another time, when she had gained admittance to him, she gave him messages from the Marretts, who had kept a great affection for the lad, who had told them tales of college that Christmas time. And she told him, too, of the coming of an old friend to see her there. "It was poor Mr. Dent," she said. "He looks so old now. His wife died 3 years ago. You know, he has a city living, and does chaplain's work at the Tower sometimes. And he is coming to see you, Anthony, and talk to you." 3 or 4 days later he came. Anthony was greatly touched at his kindness in coming. He looked considerably older than his age. His hair had grown thin and grey about his temples, and the sharp bird-like outline of his face and features seemed blurred and indeterminate. His creed, too, and his whole manner of looking at things of faith, seemed to have undergone a similar process. The two had a long talk. "I am not going to argue with you, Mr. Norris," he said. though I still think your religion wrong. But I have learnt this at least, that the greatest of all is charity, and if we love the same God and his blessed Son and one another, I think that is best of all. I have learnt that from my wife, my dear wife," he added softly. "I used to hold much with doctrine at one time, and loved to chop arguments. But our Saviour did not, and so I will not." Anthony was delighted that he took this line, for he knew there are some minds that apparently cannot be loyal to both charity and truth at the same time, and Mr. Dent's seemed to be one of them. So the two talked of old times at Great Keynes, and of the folks there, and at last of Hubert. "I saw him in the city last week," said Mr. Dent, "and he is a changed man. He looks 10 years older than this time last year. I scarcely know what has come to him. I know he has thrown up his magistracy, and the Linfield parson tells me that the talk is that Mr. Maxwell is going on another voyage, and leaving his wife and children behind him again." Anthony told him gently of Hubert's share in the events at Stanfield, adding what real and earnest attempts he had made to repair the injury he had done, as soon as he had learnt that it was his friend that was in hiding. "There was no treachery against me, Mr. Dent, you see," he added. Mr. Dent pecked a little in the air with pursed lips and eyes fixed on the ground, and a vision of the pulpit at Great Keynes moved before Anthony's eyes. "Yes, yes," he said. "I understand. I quite understand." Before Mr. Dent took his leave, he unburdened himself of what he had really come to say. "Master Anthony," he said, standing up and fingering his hat round and round, "I said I talked no doctrine now, but I must unsay that, and you will not think me impertinent if I ask you something?" "My dear Mr. Dent," began the other, standing and smiling too. "Thank you, thank you. I felt sure. Then it is this. I do not know much about the popish religion, though I used to once, and I may be very mistaken. But I would like you to satisfy me before I go, on one point." And he fixed his anxious, peering eyes on Anthony's face. "Can you say, Master Anthony, from a full heart, that you fix all your hope and confidence for salvation in Christ's merits alone?" Anthony smiled frankly in his face. "Indeed, in none other," he said, "and from a full heart." "Ah, well," and the birdlike face began to beam and twitch, "and there is nothing of confidence in yourself and your works? And there is no talk of Holy Mary in the matter?" Anthony smiled again. He wished to avoid useless controversy. "Briefly," he said, "my belief is that I am a very great sinner, that I deserve eternal hell. But I humbly place all my trust in the precious blood of my Saviour, and in that alone. Does that satisfy you?" Mr. Dent's face was breaking into smiles, and at the end he took the priest's face in his hands and kissed him gently twice on the cheeks. "Then, my dear boy, I fear nothing for you. May that salvation you hope for be yours." And then without a word he was gone. Anthony's conscience reproached him a little that he had said nothing of the Church to the minister, but Mr. Dent had been so peremptory about doctrine that it was hard for the younger man to say what he would have wished. He told him, however, plainly on his next visit that he held wholeheartedly, too, that the Catholic Church was the treasury of grace that Christ had instituted, and added a little speech about his longing to see his old friend a Catholic too. But Mr. Dent shook his head. The corners of his eyes wrinkled a little, and a shade of his old fretfulness passed over his face. "Nay, if you talk like that," he said, "I must be gone. I am no theologian. You must let me alone." He gave him news this time of Mr. Buxton. "He is in the Counter, as you know," he said, "and is a very bright and cheerful person, it seems to me. Mistress Isabel asked me to see him and give her news of him, for she cannot get admittance. He is in a cell, little and nasty; but he said to me that a Protestant prison was a Papist pleasaunce. In fact, he said it twice; and he asked very eagerly after you and Mistress Isabel. He tried, too, to inveigle me into talk of Peter, his prerogative, but I would not have it. It was Lammas Day when I saw him, and he spoke much of it." Anthony asked whether there was anything said of what punishment Mr. Buxton would suffer. "Well," said Mr. Dent, "the Lieutenant of the Tower told me that her Grace was so sad at the death of Mistress Corbet that she was determined that no more blood should be shed than was obliged over this matter, and that Mr. Buxton, he thought, would be but deprived of his estates and banished. But I know not how that may be. But we shall soon know." These weeks of waiting were full of consolation and refreshment to Anthony. The nervous stress of the life of the seminary priest in England, full of apprehension and suspense, crowned, as it had been in his case, by the fierce excitement of the last days of his liberty, all this had strained and distracted his soul; and the peace of the prison life, with the certainty that no efforts of his own could help him now, quieted and strengthened him for the ordeal he foresaw. At this time, too, he used to spend 2 or 3 hours a day in meditation, and found the greatest benefit in following the tranquil method of prayer prescribed by Louis de Blois, with whose writings he had made acquaintance at Douai. Each morning, too, he said a dry mass; and during the whole of his imprisonment at the Clink managed to make his confession at least once a week, and besides his communion at mass on Sundays, communicated occasionally from the reserved sacrament which he was able to keep in a neighbouring cell, unknown to his gaoler. And so the days went by, as orderly as in a religious house. He rose at a fixed hour, observed the greatest exactness in his devotions, and did his utmost to prevent any visitors being admitted to see him, or any from another cell coming into his own, until he had finished his first meditation and said his office. And there began to fall upon him a kind of mellow peace, that rose at times of communion and prayer to a point so ravishing that he began to understand that it would not be a light cross for which such preparatory graces were necessary. Towards the middle of September he received intelligence that evidence had been gathering against him, and that 1 or 2 were come from Lancashire under guard, and that he would be brought before the Commissioners again immediately. Within 2 days this came about. He was sent for across the water to the Tower, and after waiting an hour or two with his gaoler downstairs in the basement of the White Tower, was taken up into the great hall where the Council sat. There was a table at the farther end where they were sitting, and as Anthony looked round he saw through openings all around in the inner wall the little passage where the sentries walked, and heard their footfalls. The preliminaries of identification and the like had been disposed of at previous examinations before Mr. Young, a name full of sinister suggestiveness to the Catholics. And so, after he had been given a seat at a little distance from the table behind which the commissioners sat, he was questioned minutely as to his journey in the north of England. "What were you there for, Mr. Norris?" inquired the secretary of the council. "I went to see friends, and to do my business." "Then that resolves itself into two heads. One, who are your friends? Two, what was your business?" Now it had been established beyond a doubt at previous examinations that he was a priest. A student of Douay who had apostatized had positively identified him. So Anthony answered boldly: "My friends were Catholics, and my business was the reconciling of souls to their Creator." "And to the Pope of Rome," put in Wade. "Who is Christ's vicar," continued Anthony. "And a pestilent knave," concluded a fiery-faced man whom Anthony did not know. But the commissioners wanted more than that. It was true that Anthony was already convicted of high treason in having been ordained beyond the seas, and in exercising his priestly functions in England. But the exacting of the penalty for religion alone was apt to raise popular resentment, and it was far preferable in the eyes of the authorities to entangle a priest in the political net before killing him. So they passed over for the present his priestly functions, and first demanded a list of all the places where he had stayed in the north. "You ask what is impossible," said Anthony, with his eyes on the ground and his heart beating sharply, for he knew that now peril was near. "Well," said Wade, "let us put it another way. We know that you were at Speke Hall, Blainscow, and other places. I have a list here," and he tapped the table, "but we want your name to it." "Let me see the paper," said Anthony. Nay, tell us first." "I cannot sign the paper except I see it," said Anthony, smiling. "Give it him," said a voice from the end of the table. "Here, then," said Wade unwillingly. Anthony got up and took the paper from him, and saw one or two places named where he had not been, and saw that it had been drawn up, at any rate, partly on guesswork. He put the paper down and went back to his chair and sat down. "It is not true," he said, looking steadily at the secretary. "I cannot sign it." "Do you deny that you have been to any of these places?" inquired Wade indignantly. "The paper is not true," said Anthony again. "Well, then, show us what is not true upon it." "I cannot." "We will find means to persuade you," said the secretary. "If God permits," said Anthony. Wade glanced round inquiringly and shrugged his shoulders. One or two shook their heads. "Well, then, we will turn to another point. There are known to have been certain Jesuit priests in Lancashire in November of last year. Do you deny that, sir?" "You ask too much," said Anthony, smiling again. "They may have been there for aught I know, for I certainly did not see them elsewhere at the time you mention." Wade frowned, but the one at the end laughed loud. "He has you there, Wade," he said. "This is foolery," said the secretary. "Well, these two, Father Edward Oldcorn and Father Holtby, were in Lancashire in November, and you, Mr. Norris, spoke with them then. We wish to know where they are now, and you must tell us." "You have yet to prove that I spoke with them," said Anthony, for the trap was too transparent. "But we know that." "That may or may not be, but it is for you to prove it." "Nay, for you to tell us." "For you to prove it." Wade lost his temper. "Well, then," he cried, "take this paper and see which of us is in the right." Anthony rose again, wondering what the paper could be, and came towards the table. He saw it bore a name at the end, and as he advanced saw that it had an official appearance. Wade still held it, but Anthony took it in his hand too to steady it, and began to read. But as he read, a mist rose before his eyes, and the paper shook violently. It was a warrant to put him to the torture. Wade laughed a little. "Why, see, Mr. Norris, how you tremble at the warrant. What will it be when you—" But a voice murmured, "Shame!" and he stopped and stared. Anthony passed his hand over his eyes and went back to his chair and sat down. He saw his knees trembling as he sat, and hated himself for it. But he cried bravely: "The flesh is weak, but please God the spirit is willing." "Well, then," said Wade again, "must we execute this warrant, or will you tell us what we would know?" "You must do what God permits," said Anthony. Wade sat down, throwing the warrant on the table, and began to talk in a low voice to those who sat next him. Anthony fixed his eyes on the ground and did his utmost to keep his thoughts steady. Now he realized where he was, and what it all meant. The little door to the left behind him, that he had noticed as he came in, was the door of which he had heard other Catholics speak, that led down to the great crypt where so many before him had screamed and fainted and called on God, from the rack that stood at the foot of the stairs, or from the pillar with the fixed ring at its summit. He had faced all this in his mind again and again, but it was a different thing to have the horror within arm's length. Old phrases he had heard of the torture rang in his mind. A boast of Norton's, the rack master, who had racked Brian, and which had been repeated from mouth to mouth, that he had made Brian a foot longer than God made him. Words of James Maxwell's that he had let drop at Douay. The remembrance of his limp, and of Campion's powerlessness to raise his hand when called upon to swear. All these things crowded on him now, and there seemed to rest on him a crushing swarm of fearful images and words. He made a great effort, and closed his eyes, and repeated the holy name of Jesus over and over again. But the struggle was still fierce when Wade's voice, harsh and dry, broke in and scattered the confusion of mind that bewildered him. "Take the prisoner to a cell. He is not to go back to the Clink." Anthony felt a hand on his arm, and the gaoler was looking at him with compassion. "Come, sir," he said. Anthony rose, feeling heavy and exhausted, but remembered to bow to the commissioners, one or two of whom returned it. Then he followed the gaoler out into the anteroom, who handed him over to one of the Tower officials. "I must leave you here, sir," he said, "but keep a good heart. It will not be for to-day." When Anthony got to his new cell, which was in the Salt Tower, he was bitterly angry and disappointed with himself. Why, he had turned white and sick like a child, not at the pain of the rack, not even at the sight of it, but at the mere warrant. He threw himself on his knees, and bowed down till his head beat against the boards. "O Lord Jesus," he prayed, "give me of thy manhood." He found that this prison was more rigorous than the Clink. No liberty to leave the cell could possibly be obtained, and no furniture was provided. The gaoler, when he had brought up his dinner, asked whether he could send any message for him for a bed. Anthony gave Isabel's address, knowing that the authorities were already aware that she was a Catholic, and indeed she had given bail to come up for trial if called upon, and that his information could injure neither her nor the Merritts, who were sound Church of England people. And in the afternoon a mattress and some clothes arrived for him. Anthony noticed at dinner that the knife provided was of a very inconvenient shape, having a round blunt point, and being sharp only at a lower part of the blade; and when the keeper came up with his supper, he asked him to bring him another kind. The man looked at him with a queer expression. "What is the matter?" asked Anthony. "Cannot you oblige me?" The man shook his head. "They are the knives that are always given to the prisoners under warrant for torture." Anthony did not understand him, and looked at him, puzzled. "For fear they should do themselves an injury," added the gaoler. Then the same shudder ran over his body again. "You mean he began. The gaoler nodded, still looking at him oddly, and went out, and Anthony sat with his supper untasted, staring before him. By a kind of violent reaction he had a long happy dream that night. The fierce emotions of that day had swept over his imagination and scoured it as with fire; and now the underlying peace rose up and flooded it with sweetness. He thought he was in the north again, high up on a moor, walking with one who was quite familiar to him, but whose person he could not remember when he woke. He did not even know whether it was man or woman. It was a perfect autumn day, he thought, like one of those he had spent there last year. The heather and the gorse were in flower, and the air was redolent from their blossoms. He commented on this to the person at his side, who told him it was always so there. Mile after mile the moor rose and dipped, and although Skiddaw was on his right, purple and grey, yet to his left there was a long curved horizon of sparkling blue sea. It was a cloudless day overhead, and the air seemed kindling and fresh round him as it blew across the stretches of heather from the western sea. He himself felt full of an extraordinary vitality, and the mere movement of his limbs gave him joy as he went swiftly and easily forward over the heather. There was the sound of the wind in his ears, and again there came the gush of water from somewhere out of sight, as he had heard it in the church by Skiddaw. There was no house or building of any kind within sight, and he felt a great relief in these miles of heath and the sense of holiday that they gave him. But all the joy round him and in his heart found their point for him in the person that went with him. This presence was their centre, as a diamond in a gold ring, or as a throned figure in a court circle. All else existed for the sake of this person. The heather blossomed, and the gorse incensed the air, and the sea sparkled, and the sky was blue, and the air kindled, and his own heart warmed and throbbed for that only. When he tried to see who it was, there was nothing to see. The presence existed there as a centre in a sphere, immeasurable and indiscernible. Sometimes he thought it was Mary; sometimes he thought it Henry Buxton; sometimes Isabel. Once even he assured himself it was Mistress Margaret, and once James Maxwell. And with the very act of identification came indecision again. This uncertainty waxed into a torment, and yet a sweet torment, as of a lover who watches his mistress' shuttered house. And this torment swelled yet higher and deeper, until it was so great that it had absorbed the whole radiant, fragrant circle of the hills where he walked. And then came the blinding knowledge that the presence was all these persons so dear to him, and far more; that every tenderness and grace that he had loved in them, Mary's gallantry, and Isabel's serene silence, and his friend's fellowship, and the rest, floated in the translucent depths of it, stained and irradiated by it, as motes in a sunbeam. And then he woke, and it was through tears of pure joy that he saw the rafters overhead, and the great barred door, and the discoloured wall above his bed. When his gaoler brought him dinner that day, it was half an hour earlier than usual, and when Anthony asked him the reason, he said that he did not know, but that the orders had run so. but that Mr. Morris might take heart, it was not for the torture; for Mr. Topcliffe, who superintended it, had told the keeper of the rack house that nothing would be wanted that day. He had hardly finished dinner when the gaoler came up again and said that the lieutenant was waiting for him below, and that he must bring his hat and cloak. Since his arrest he had worn his priest's habit every day, so he now threw the cloak over his arm and took his hat and followed the gaoler down. In passing through the court he went by a group of men that were talking together, and he noticed very especially a tall old man with a grey head, in a court suit with a sword, and very lean about the throat, who looked at him hard as he passed. As he reached the archway where the lieutenant was waiting, he turned again and saw the sunken eyes of the old man still looking after him. When he turned to the gaoler, he saw the same odd look in his face that he had noticed before. "Why do you look like that?" he asked. "Who is that old man?" "That is Mr. Topcliffe," said the keeper. The Lieutenant of the Tower, Sir Richard Barkley, saluted him kindly at the gate, and begged him to follow him. The keeper still came after, and another stepped out and joined them, and the group of four together passed out through the Lion's Tower and across the moat to a little doorway where a closed carriage was waiting. The lieutenant and Anthony stepped inside, the two keepers mounted outside, and the carriage set off. Then the lieutenant turned to the priest. "Do you know where you are going, Mr. Norris?" "No, sir." "You are going to Whitehall to see the Queen's Grace." Chapter 14. Part 3, Chapter 14 of By What Authority, by Robert Hugh Benson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. An open door. When the carriage reached the palace, they were told that the Queen was not yet come from Greenwich, and they were shown into a little anteroom next to the gallery where the interview was to take place. The Queen, the lieutenant told Anthony, was to come up that afternoon passing through London, and that she had desired to see him on her way through to Nonsuch. He could not tell him why he was sent for, though he conjectured it was because of Mistress Corbet's death, and that her Grace wished to know the details. "However," said the lieutenant, "you now have your opportunity to speak for yourself, and I think you a very fortunate man, Mr. Norris. Few have had such a privilege, though I remember that Mr. Campion had it too, though he made poor use of it." Anthony said nothing. His mind was throbbing with memories and associations. The air of state and luxury in the corridors through which he had just come, the discreet guarded doors, the servants in the royal liveries standing here and there, the sense of expectancy that mingled with the solemn hush of the palace, all served to bring up the figure of Mary Corbet, whom he had seen so often in these circumstances, and the thought of her made the peril in which he stood, and the hope of escape from it, seem very secondary matters. He walked to the window presently, and looked out upon the little court below, one of the innumerable yards of that vast palace, and stood staring down on the hound that was chained there near one of the entrances, and that yawned and blinked in the autumn sunshine. Even as he looked, the dog paused in the middle of his stretch and stood expectant with his ears cocked. A servant dashed bareheaded down a couple of steps and out through the low archway, and simultaneously Anthony heard once more the sweet shrill trumpets that told of the Queen's approach. Then there came the roll of drums, and the thunder of horses' feet, and the noise of wheels. The trumpets sang out again nearer, and the rumbling waxed louder as the Queen's cavalcade, out of sight, passed the entrance of the archway, down upon which Anthony looked, and then stilled, and the palace itself began to hum and stir. A door or two banged in the distance. Feet ran past the door of the anteroom, and the strain of the trumpets sounded once in the house itself. Then all grew quiet once more, and Anthony turned from the window and sat down again by the lieutenant. There was silence for a few minutes. The lieutenant stroked his beard gently, and said a word or two under his breath now and again to Anthony. Once or twice there came the swift rustle of a dress outside as a lady hurried past, then the sound of a door opening and shutting, then more silence, then the sound of low talking, and at last the sound of footsteps going slowly up and down the gallery which adjoined the anteroom. Still the minutes passed, but no summons came. Anthony rose and went to the window again, for in spite of himself this waiting told upon him. The dog had gone back to his kennel, and was lying with his nose just outside the opening. Anthony wondered vacantly to himself what door it was that he was guarding, and who lived in the rooms that looked out beside it. Then suddenly the door from the gallery opened, and a page appeared. "The Queen's Grace will see Mr. Norris alone." Anthony went towards him, and the page opened the door wide for him to go through, and then closed it noiselessly behind him, and Anthony was in the presence. It was with a sudden bewilderment that he recognized he was in the same gallery as that in which he had talked and sat with Mary Corbet. There were the long tapestries hanging opposite him, with the tall 3 windows dividing them, and the suits of steel armour that he remembered. He even recalled the pattern of the carpet across which Mary Corbet had come forward to meet him, and that still lay before the tall window at the end that looked on to the tilt-yard. The sun was passing round to the west now, and shone again across the golden haze of the yard through this great window, with the fragments of stained glass at the top. The memory leaped into life even as he stepped out and stood for a moment, dazed in the sunshine, at the door that opened from the anteroom. But the figure that turned from the window and faced him was not like Mary's. It was the figure of an old woman, who looked tall with her towering headdress and nodding plume. She was dressed in a great dark red mantle thrown back on her shoulders, and beneath it was a pale yellow dress sewn all over with queer devices. On the puffed sleeve of the arm that held the stick was embroidered a great curling snake that shone with gold thread and jewels in the sunlight, and powdered over the skirt were representations of human eyes and other devices, embroidered with dark thread that showed up plainly on the pale ground. So much he saw down one side of the figure on which the light shone; the rest was to his dazzled eyes in dark shadow. He went down on his knees at once before this tremendous figure, seeing the buckled feet that twinkled below the skirt cut short in front, and remained there. There was complete silence for a moment while he felt the Queen looking at him, and then the voice he remembered, only older and harsher, now said: "What is all this, Mr. Norris?" Anthony looked for a moment and saw the Queen's eyes fixed on him, but he said nothing and looked down again. "Stand up," said the Queen, not unkindly, "and walk with me." Anthony stood up at once, and heard the stiff rustle of her dress and the tap of her heels and stick on the polished boards as she came towards him. Then he turned with her down the long gallery. Until this moment, ever since he had heard that he was to see the Queen, he had felt nervous and miserable. But now this had left him, and he felt at his ease. To be received in this way in privacy, and to accompany her up and down the gallery as she took her afternoon exercise, was less embarrassing than the formal interview he had expected. The two walked the whole length of the gallery without a word, and it was not until they turned and faced the end that looked on to the tilt-yard that the Queen spoke, and her voice was almost tender. "I understand that you were with Minnie Corbet when she died," she said. "She died for me, your Grace," said Anthony. The Queen looked at him sharply. "Tell me the tale," she said. And Anthony told her the whole story of the escape and the ride, speaking too for his friend Mr. Buxton, and of Mary's affection for him. "Your Grace," he ended, "it sounds a poor tale of a man, that a woman should die for him so; but I can say with truth that with God's grace I would have died 100 deaths to save her." The Queen was silent for a good while when the story was over, and Anthony thought that perhaps she could not speak, but he dared not look at her. Then she spoke very harshly. "And you, Mr. Norris, why did you not escape?" "Your Grace would not have done so." "When I saw that she was dying, I would." "Not if you had been a priest, your Grace." "What is that?" asked the Queen, suddenly facing him. "I am a priest, madam, and she was a Catholic, and my duty was beside her." "Eh?" "I shrived her, your Grace, before she died." "Why, they did not tell me that." Anthony was silent. They walked on a few steps, and the Queen stood silent too, looking down upon the tilt-yard. Then she turned abruptly, and Anthony turned with her, and they began to go up and down again. "It was gallant of you both," she said shortly. "I love that my people should be of that sort." Then she paused. "Tell me," she went on, "did Mary love me?" Anthony was silent for a moment. "The truth, Mr. Norris," she said. "Mistress Corbet was loyalty itself," he answered. "Nay, nay, nay, not loyalty, but love I asked you of. How did she speak of me?" "Well, your Grace, Mistress Corbet had a shrewd wit, and she used it freely on friend and foe. But her very sharpness on your Grace sometimes showed her love, for she hated to think you otherwise than what she deemed the best." The Queen stopped full in her walk. "That is very pleasantly put," she said. "I told Minnie you were a courtier." Again the two walked on. "Then she used her tongue on me?" "Your Grace, I have never met one on whom she did not. But her heart was true." "I know that, Mr. Norris. Tell me something she said." Anthony racked his brains for something not too severe. "Mistress Corbet once said that the Queen's most disobedient subject was herself." "Eh?" said Elizabeth, stopping in her walk. "Because," said Mistress Corbet, "she can never command herself," finished Anthony. The Queen looked at Anthony, puzzled a moment, and then chuckled loudly in her throat. "The impertinent minx!" she said. "That was when I had clouted her, no doubt." Again they walked up and down in silence a little while. Anthony began to wonder whether this was all for which the Queen had sent for him. He was astonished at his own self-possession. All the trembling awe with which he had faced the Queen at Greenwich was gone. He had forgotten for the moment even his own peril, and he felt instead even something of pity for this passionate old woman who had aged so quickly, whose favourites one by one were dropping off, or at the best giving her only an exaggerated and ridiculous devotion, at the absurdity of which all the world laughed. Here was this old creature at his side, surrounded by flatterers and adventurers, advancing through the world in splendid and jewelled raiment, with trumpets blowing before her, and poets singing her praises, and crowds applauding in the streets, and sneering in their own houses at the withered old virgin Queen who still thought herself a Diana, and all the while this triumphal progress was at the expense of God's Church. Her car rolled over the bodies of his servants, and her shrunken gemmed fingers were red in their blood. So she advanced, thought Anthony, day by day towards the black truth and the eternal loneliness of the darkness that lies outside the realm where Christ only is King. Elizabeth broke in suddenly on his thoughts. "Now," she said, And what of you, Mr. Norris?" "I am your Grace's servant," he said. "I am not so sure of that," said Elizabeth. "If you are my servant, why are you a priest, contrary to my laws?" "Because I am Christ's servant too, your Grace." "But Christ's apostle said, 'Obey them that have the rule over you.'" "In indifferent matters, madam." The Queen frowned and made a little angry sound. "Oh, I cannot understand you papists," said the Queen. "What, a God's name, do you want? You have liberty of thought and faith. I desire to inquire into no man's private opinions. You may worship Ashtaroth, if it please you, in your own hearts, and God looks to the heart and not to the outer man. There is a church with bishops like your own, and ministers. There are the old churches to worship in. Nay, you may find the old ornaments still in use. We have sacraments, as you have. You may seek shrift if you will. Nay, in some manner we have the mass, though we do not call it so. But we follow Christ's ordinance in the matter, and you can do no more. We have the word of God, as you have, and we use the same creeds. What more can the rankest papist ask? Tell me that, Mr. Norris, for I am aweary of your folk." The Queen turned and faced him again a moment, and her eyes were peevish and resentful. Presently she went on again. "Mr. Campion told me it was the oath that troubled him. He could not take it, he said. I told the fool that I was not head of the Church as Christ was, but only the supreme governor, as the Act declares, in all spiritual and ecclesiastical things. I forget how it runs, but I showed it him, and asked him whether it were not true, and I asked him too how it was that Margaret Roper could take the oath, and so many thousands of persons as full Christian as himself, and he could not answer me." The Queen was silent again. Then once more she went on indignantly. "It is yourselves that have brought all this trouble on your heads. See what the papists have done against me. They have excommunicated me, deposed me, though in spite of it I still sit on the throne. They have sent an armada against me. They have plotted against me, I know not how many times. And then, when I defend myself and hang a few of the wolves, lo, they are Christ's flock at once, for whom he shed his precious blood, and his persecuted lambs, and I am Jezebel straightway, and Athaliah, and Beelzebub's wife, and I know not what." The Queen stopped out of breath, and looked fiercely at Anthony, who said nothing. "Tell me how you answer that, Mr. Norris," said the Queen. "I dare not deal with such great matters," said Anthony, "for your Grace knows well that I am but a poor priest that knows naught of statecraft. But I would like to ask your Highness two questions only. The first is, whether your Grace had aught to complain of in the conduct of your Catholic subjects when the Armada was here; and the second, whether there hath been one actual attempt upon your Grace's life by private persons?" "That is not to the purpose," said the Queen peevishly. "It was Catholics who fought against me in the Armada, and it was Catholics who plotted against me at court." "Then there is a difference in Catholics, your Grace," said Anthony. "Ah, I see what you would be at." "Yes, your Highness. I would rather say, although they be Catholics, they do these things." There was silence again, which Anthony did not dare to break, and the two walked up the whole length of the gallery without speaking. "Well, well," said Elizabeth at last, "but this was not why I sent for you. We will speak of yourself now, Mr. Norris."
"I hope you are not an obstinate fellow, eh?" Anthony said nothing, and the Queen went on. "Now, as I have told you, I judge no man's private opinions. You may believe what you will. Remember that. You may believe what you will. Nay, you may practice your religion so long as it is private and unknown to me." Anthony began to wonder what was coming, but he still said nothing as the Queen paused. She stood a moment looking down into the empty tilt-yard again, and then turned and sat suddenly in a chair that stood beside the window, and put up a jewelled hand to shield her face, with her elbow on the arm, while Anthony stood before her. "I remember you, Mr. Norris, very well at Greenwich. You spoke up sharply enough, and you looked me in the eyes now and then, as I like a man to do. And then Minnie loved you too. I wish to show you kindness for her sake." Anthony's heart began to fail him, for he guessed now what was coming, and the bitter struggle that lay before him. "Now, I know well that the commissioners have had you before them. They are tiresome busybodies. Walsingham started all that, and set them a-spying, and a-defending of my person, and the rest of it. But they are loyal folk, and I suppose they asked you where you had been, and with whom you had stayed, and so on." "They did, your Grace." "And you would not tell them, I suppose?" "I could not, madam. It would have been against justice and charity to do so." "Well, well, there is no need now, for I mean to take you out of their hands." A great leap of hope made itself felt in Anthony's heart. He did not know how heavy the apprehension lay on him, till this light shone through. "They will be wrath with me, I know, and will tell me that they cannot defend me if I will not help them. But when all is said, I am Queen. Now, I do not ask you to be a minister of my church, for that I think you would never be, but I think you would like to be near me. Is it not so? And I wish you to have some post about the court. I must see what it is to be." Anthony's heart began to sink again as he watched the Queen's face as she sat tapping a foot softly, and looking on the floor as she talked. Those lines of self-will about the eyes and mouth surely meant something. Then she looked up, still with her cheek on her right hand. "You do not thank me, Mr. Norris." Anthony made a great effort, but he heard his own voice quiver a little. "I thank your Grace for your kindly intentions toward me, with all my heart." The Queen seemed satisfied, and looked down again. "As to the oath, I will not ask you to take it formally, if you will give me an assurance of your loyalty. That, your Grace, I give most gladly." His heart was beating again in great irregular thumps in his throat. He had the sensation of swaying to and fro on the edge of a precipice, now towards safety and now towards death. It was the cruelest pain he had suffered yet. But how was it possible to have some post at court without relinquishing the exercise of his priesthood? He must think it out. What did the Queen mean? "And of course you will not be able to say Mass again, but I shall not hinder your hearing it at the ambassador's whenever you please." Ah, it had come. His heart gave a leap and seemed to cease. "Your Grace must forgive me, but I cannot consent." There was a dead silence. When Anthony looked up, she was staring at him with the frankest astonishment. "Did you think, Mr. Norris, you could be at court and say Mass too whenever you wished?" Her voice rang harsh and shrill. Her anger was rising. "I was not sure what your Grace intended for me." "The fellow is mad," she said, still staring at him. "Oh, take care, take care!" "Your Grace knows I intend no insolence." You mean to say, Mr. Norris, that you will not take a pardon and a post at court on those terms?" Anthony bowed. He could not trust himself to speak, so bitter was the reaction. "But see, man, you fool, if you die as a traitor, you will never say mass again either." "But that will not be with my consent, your Grace." "And you refuse the pardon?" "On those terms, your Grace, I must." "Well," and she was silent a moment. "You are a fool, sir." Anthony bowed again. "But I like courage. Well, then, you will not be my servant?" "I have ever been that, your Grace, and ever will be." "Well, well, but not at court?" "Ah, your Grace knows I cannot," cried Anthony, and his voice rang sorrowfully. Again there was silence. "You must have your way, sir, for poor Minnie's sake, but it passes my understanding what you mean by it. And let me tell you that not many have their way with me rather than mine." Again hope leaped up in his heart. The Queen then was not so ungracious. He looked up and smiled, and down again. "Why, the man's lips are all a quiver. What ails him?" "It is your Grace's kindness." "I must say I marvel at it myself," observed Elizabeth. "You near angered me just now. Take care you do not so quite." "I would not willingly, as your Grace knows." "Then we will end this matter. You give me your assurance of loyalty to my person." "With all my heart, madam," said Anthony eagerly. "Then you must get to France within the week. The other too, Buxton, he loses his estate, but has his life. I am doing much for Minnie's sake." "How can I thank your Grace?" "And I will cause Sir Richard to give it out that you have taken the oath. Call him in." There was a quick gasp from the priest, and then he cried with agony in his voice, "I cannot, your Grace, I cannot." "Cannot call Sir Richard? Why, are you mad, sir?" "Cannot consent. I have taken no oath." "I know you have not. I do not ask it." Elizabeth's voice came short and harsh. Her patience was vanishing, and Anthony knew it and looked at her. She had dropped her hand, and it was clenching and unclenching on her knee. Her stick slipped on the polished boards and fell, but she paid it no attention. She was looking straight at the priest. Her high eyebrows were coming down. Her mouth was beginning to mumble a little. He could see in the clear sunlight that fell on her sideways through the tall windows 1,000 little wrinkles, and all seemed alive. The lines at the corners of her eyes and mouth deepened as he watched. "What, a Christ's name, do you want, sir?" It was like the first mutter of a storm on the horizon, but Anthony knew it must break. He did not answer. "Tell me, sir, what is it now?" Anthony drew a long breath and braced his will, but even as he spoke he knew he was pronouncing his own sentence. "I cannot consent to leave the country and let it be given out that I had taken the oath, your Grace. It would be an apostasy from my faith." Elizabeth sprang to her feet without her stick, took one step forward, and gave Anthony a fierce blow on the cheek with her ringed hand. He recoiled a step at the shock of it, and stood waiting with his eyes on the ground. Then the Queen's anger poured out in words. Her eyes burned with passion out of an ivory-colored face, and her voice rang high and harsh, and her hands continually clenched and unclenched as she screamed at him. "God's body, you are the ungratefullest hound that ever drew breath. I send for you to my presence, and talk and walk with you like a friend. I offer you a pardon, and you fling it in my face. I offer you a post at court, and you mock it. You flaunt you in your treasonable livery in my very face, and laugh at my clemency. You think I am no queen, but a weak woman whom you can turn and rule at your will. God's son, I will show you which is sovereign. Call Sir Richard in, sir. I will have him in this instant." "Sir Richard! Sir Richard!" She screamed, stamping with fury. The door into the ante-room behind opened, and Sir Richard Barkley appeared, with a face full of apprehension. He knelt at once. "Stand up, Sir Richard!" she cried, "and look at this man. You know him, do you not? And I know him now, the insolent dog. But his own mother shall not in a week. Look at him shaking there, the knave. He will shake more before I have done with him. Take him back with you, Sir Richard, and let them have their will of him. His damned pride and insolence shall be broken. Spotty, I have never been so treated. Take him out, Sir Richard, take him out, I tell you." End of chapter 14.
Part 3, Chapter 15 of By What Authority by Robert Hugh Benson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The rolling of the stone. It was a week later, and a little before dawn, that Isabel was kneeling by Anthony's bed in his room in the Tower. The lieutenant had sent for her to his lodging the evening before, and she had spent the whole night with her brother. He had been racked 4 times in 1 week, and was dying. The city and the prison were very quiet now. The carts had not yet begun to roll over the cobblestones, and the last night wanderers had gone home. He lay on the mattress that she had sent in to him, in the corner of his cell, under the window, on his back and very still, covered from chin to feet with her own fur-lined cloak that she had thrown over him. His head was on a low pillow, for he could not bear to lie high. His feet made a little mound under the coverlet, and his arms lay straight at his side. But all that could be seen of him was his face, pinched and white now, with hollows in his cheeks, and dark patches and lines beneath his closed eyes, and his soft pointed brown beard that just rested on the fur edging of Isabel's cloak. His lips were drawn tight, but slightly parted, showing the rim of his white teeth, as if he snarled with pain. The only furniture in the room was a single table and chair. The table was drawn up, not far from the bed, and a book or two, with a flask of cordial and some fragments of food on a plate, lay upon it. His cloak and doublet and ruff lay across the chair, and his shoes below it, and a little linen lay in a pile in another corner. But the clothes in which he had been tortured the evening before, his shirt and hose, could not be taken off him, and he lay in them still. They had been so soaked with sweat that Isabel had found him shivering, and laid her cloak over him, and now he lay quiet and warm. Earlier in the night she had been reading to him, and a taper still burned in a candlestick on the table. But for the last 2 hours he had lain either in a sleep or a swoon, and she had laid the book down and was watching him. He was so motionless that he would have seemed dead, except for the steady rise and fall of a fold in the mantle, and for a sudden muscular twitch every few minutes. Isabel herself was scarcely less motionless. Her face was clear and pale, as it always was, but perfectly serene, and even her lips did not quiver. She was kneeling and leaning back now, and her hands were clasped in her lap. There was a proud content in her face. Her dear brother had not uttered one name on the rack, except those of the Saviour and of the Blessed Mother. So the lieutenant had told her. Suddenly his eyes opened, and there was nothing but peace in them, and his lips moved. Isabel leaned forward on her hands and bent her ear to his mouth till his breath was warm on it, and she could hear the whisper. Then she opened the book that lay face down on the table, and began to read on, from the point at which she had laid it down 2 hours before. Erat autem ora tertia, et crucifixerunt eum. And it was the 3rd hour, and they crucified him. And with him they crucify two thieves, the one on his right hand, and the other on his left. And the scripture was fulfilled, which saith, And he was numbered with the transgressors. Her voice was slow and steady as she read the unfamiliar Latin, still kneeling, with the book a little raised to catch the candlelight, and her grave, tranquil eyes bent upon it. Only once did her voice falter, and then she commanded it again immediately, and that as she read, Erant autem et mulieres de longe aspicientes. There were also women looking on afar off. And so the tale crept on minute by minute, and the priest lay with closed eyes to hear it, until the mocking was complete, and the darkness of the sixth hour had come and gone, and the Saviour had cried aloud on his Father, and given up the ghost, and the centurion that stood by had borne witness, and the great criminal slept in the garden in the sepulchre, wherein was never man yet laid. There was a listening silence as the voice ceased without another falter. Isabel laid the book down and looked at him again, and his eyes opened languidly. He had not yet said more than single words, and even now his voice was so faint that she had to put her ear close to his mouth. It seemed to her that his soul had gone into some secret inner chamber of profound peace, so deep that it was a long and difficult task to send a thought to the surface through his lips. She could just hear him, and she answered clearly and slowly, as to a dazed child, pausing between every word. I cannot get a priest. It is not allowed. Still his eyes bent on her. What was it he said? What was it? Then she heard, and began to repeat short acts of contrition, clearly and distinctly, pausing between the phrases, in English, and his eyes closed as she began. O my Jesus, I am heartily sorry that I have crucified thee by my sins. Wash my soul in thy precious blood. O my God, I am sorry that I have displeased thee. Because thou art all good, I hate all the sins that I have done against thy divine majesty. And so, phrase after phrase, she went on, giving him time to hear and to make an inner assent of the will, and repeating also other short vocal prayers that she knew by heart. And so the delicate skein of prayer rose from the altar where this morning sacrifice lay before God, waiting the consummation of his acceptance. Presently she ended, and he lay again with closed eyes and mute face. Then again they opened, and she bent down to listen. It will all be well with me, she answered, raising her head again. Mistress Margaret has written from Brussels. I shall go there for a while. Yes, Mr. Buxton will take me next week. He goes to Normandy, to his estate. Again his lips moved, and she listened. A faint flush came over her face. She shook her head. I do not know. I think not. I hope to enter religion. No, I have not yet determined. The Dower House? Yes, I will sell it. Yes, to Hubert if he wishes it. Every word he whispered was such an effort that she had to pause again and again before he could make her understand, and often she judged more by the movement of his lips than by any sound that came from him. Now and then, too, she lifted her handkerchief, soaked in a strong violet scent, and passed it over his forehead and lips. She motioned with the flask of cordial once or twice, but his eyes closed for a negative. As she knelt and watched him, her thoughts circled continually in little flights. to the walled garden of the Dower House in sunshine, and Anthony running across it in his brown suit, with the wallflowers behind him against the old red bricks and ivy, and the tall chestnut rising behind, to the wind-swept hills, with the thistles and the goldenrod, and the hazel thickets, and Anthony on his pony, sunburnt and voluble, hawk on wrist, with a light in his eyes, to the warm panelled hall in winter, with the tapers on the round table, and Anthony flat on his face, with his feet in the air before the hearth that glowed and roared up the wide chimney behind, and his chin on his hands, and a book open before him. Or farther back even still, to Anthony's little room at the top of the house, his clothes on a chair, and the boy himself sitting up in bed with his arms round his knees as she came in to wish him good night and talk to him a minute or two. And every time the circling thought came home and settled again on the sight of that still straight figure lying on the mattress against the discoloured bricks, with the light of the taper glimmering on his thin face and brown hair and beard, and every time her heart consented that this was the best of all. A bird chirped suddenly from some hole in the tower once, and then 3 or 4 times. She glanced up at the window, and the light of dawn was beginning. Then, as the minutes went by, the city began to stir itself from sleep. There came a hollow whine from the Lion Gate 50 yards away. Up from the river came the shout of a waterman. 2 or 3 times a late cock crew, and still the light crept on and broadened, but Anthony still lay with his eyes closed. At last over the cobbles outside a cart rattled, turned a corner, and was silent. Anthony had opened his eyes now, and was looking at her again, and again she bent down to listen, and then opened and read again. Et cum transiset sabbatum Maria Magdalene et Maria Jacobi et Salome emerunt aromata, et venientes ungerent Jesum. And when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome had brought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. A slight sound made her look up. Anthony's eyes were kindling and his lips moved. She bent again and listened. What was it he said? Yes, it was so, and she smiled and nodded at him. She was reading the Gospel for Easter Day, the Gospel of the first Mass that they had heard together on that spring morning at Great Keyne, when their Lord had led them so far round by separate paths to meet one another at his altar, and now they were met again here. She read on. Et valde mane una sabbatorum veniunt ad monumentum orto jam sole. Very early they came into the sepulchre at the rising of the sun, and they said among themselves, Who shall roll us away the stone from the door of the sepulchre? And when they looked, they saw that the stone was rolled away, for it was very great. Manus valde, read Isabel, and looked up again, and then closed the book. There was no need to read more. She walked across the court half an hour later, just as the sun came up, and passed out through the lieutenant's lodging, and out by the narrow bridge onto the Tower wharf. To the left and behind her, as she looked eastwards down the river, lay the heavy masses of the prison she had left, and the high walls and turrets were gilded with glory. The broad river itself was one rolling glory too. The tide was coming in swift and strong, and a barge or two moved upwards, only half seen in the bewildering path of the sun. The air was cool and keen, and a breeze from the water stirred Isabel's hair as she stood looking, with the light on her face. It was a cloudless October morning overhead. Even as she stood, a flock of pigeons streamed across from the south side, swift flying and bathed in light, and her eyes followed them a moment or two. As she stood there silent, a step came up the wharf from the direction of St. Catherine's Street, and a man came walking quickly towards her. He did not see who she was until he was close, and then he started and took off his hat. It was Lackington, on his way to some business at the Tower. But she did not seem to see him. She turned almost immediately and began to walk westwards, and the glory in her eyes was supreme, and as she went the day deepened above her. End of Part 3, Chapter 15. End of By What Authority by Robert Hugh Benson. Recording by Carol Pelster.